Hi, thank you for joining me today to explore conservation issues related to the effects of bear viewing on bears. Bear viewing is an important source of revenue for commercial operators, including First Nations. There is a belief, however, that the industry is ecotourism and non-consumptive because bears are shot with cameras rather than guns. However, the Anthropocene is characterized by rapid human expansion, and the bear viewing industry is no exception. It is seeing unregulated and uncontrolled growth all up the west coast of BC. Successful viewing operations require bears to coexist with humans. Some bears appear to be successful at adapting, persisting, and may even possibly thrive, while others may be spatially and/or temporally displaced. Viewing could make bears more susceptible to population declines. Therefore, understanding the mechanisms that facilitate population persistence is necessary for conservation, particularly of these highly viewed bears. The study area is in the west coast of BC, Canada, within the traditional lands of the Untitled Nation. It is their Indian Reserve number 4, and it encompasses 3.3 kilometers spread that are focused around the Orford and Albard rivers, which are prolific salmon spawning rivers. They contain all 5 species of salmon, but the primary 2 spawners are pinks and chums. Commercial bear viewing began in 2002, and the nation started recording numbers in 2008. And what we see is significant growth of this industry. The study I'm about to present took place between 2015 and 2017, where there was an average of 3,597 bear viewers in just 66 days of bear viewing. The nation wanted to know how many bears were using the viewing area, how viewing affects the social dominance hierarchy of these bears, and the daily behavioral patterns of grizzly bears during this full occupancy viewing operation. What they had wanted to do and why they originally came is that they wanted to add more viewing platforms, more viewing towers to the area. They said that capture and handling of bears was not permitted, nor were any other invasive techniques. We were not allowed to use color marking or anything that made the bears appear to be less wild. So I designed a study that used 7 infrared motion cameras and aimed them at rub objects and along bear trails. I paired them with barbed wire so we could obtain hair for DNA, and I did a paired sample design. So just quickly, 2 of the cameras were placed where we had a marked tree bisected by a road. So we had camera, road, and then the rub object. 2 were adjacent to a road, so we would have camera, rub object here, and the road going around it. And 2 were off-road. And then, of course, we had the estuary, which I could not pair because there was only 1 estuary. So let's take a little look at the results. This is all cameras paired together. So here we have bear activity or detections per week here. And then on this axis, on your secondary axis, we have the camera trap sampling effort. So if all 7 cameras are working, this is going to be at 100%. And if some cameras go down, then this will go down. What I did is I took a look at the bear activity and broke this up into 4 seasons. So here we have a viewing season. The viewing season is going from August 6th to November 4th. So here's the viewing season. Here's the viewing season again. After it comes post-viewing, starting about here, about the 5th of November to the 30th of December. And that corresponds with a second run, which is not as big as the first run. Then we have winter. You can see basically no bears being detected in winter. One came out here. That's the 1st of January to the 22nd of April. And then the bears come back to Orford Bay for breeding. So this is the 3rd week of April to the 1st week of July. Then they leave again. During the summer season, we have next to no grizzly bears and back for viewing. So very consistent pattern. The bears aren't coming to Orford Bay just to be viewed. This actually obviously corresponds with the salmon season. So you can see in 2015 was a pink year with about 27,000 pinks returning. Pinks are every other year spawners. So in 2016, we had a chum year with approximately 37,000 chum. So when we look at the realized population estimate by season, so I dropped winter because there was next to no individuals, and same with summer. But if we look at breeding here, it's an estimate of 15 individuals moving into the area during this spring breeding season. Then, as we said, in the summer, there's next to none. They move out, right? But during the viewing season, this estimate goes up. The actual estimate is 107 bears in a 3.3 kilometer square area. Okay? And then in the post-viewing season, it drops as bears leave for hibernation in other areas, but still 39 bears is the estimate in the post-viewing season. So let's look at the DNA results. We identified 71 different individuals through DNA, and it's pretty 50-50 split. We have 35 females and 36 males. Interestingly, no females were detected during the breeding season. I have no idea why. We're going to look into this further. We sampled with the same intensity. We had 1 female during the summer, 34 during the viewing season, and 9 after the viewing season had finished. Of interest was this 1 female that was detected during, in the other seasons and not during the viewing season. So as I said, the data was paired with cameras. We went back to look, okay, who is this? What's showing up in these cameras? And it turned out to be a family group, a female with 3 cubs. They all crossed the wire. My guess is that the hair that we actually gathered was from one of the cubs, and that cub did not survive to the next year. Let's take a look at our males. We had 36 males detected. 1 of them was detected in winter and 7 during the breeding season. Interestingly, 3 of those were not detected in any other season in any other years. None were in summer, 32 were during the viewing season, and 11 after the viewing season. So we wanted to see who are these 3 males that are only detected during this breeding season. So we went and pulled their files. And there we have, there's 1 of the males, there's 2 of them. These are classified as large adult males, actually extremely large. These bears are close to your 1,000-pound mark, right? This is just a medium adult male. He's scrunched down here because he's rubbing on the tree, but he is still quite a big bear, right? So that's who they were. These were all fully breeding males. So we want to take a look, okay, well, how far are bears being drawn to this area? We don't have radio collars, we don't know. So we went and asked other researchers for permission to compare genotypes, and generously, Clayton Apps allowed us to compare with his study areas in the Toba and the Southgate. Steve Roschetta allowed us to compare with his in the Toba as well, and Cedar Mueller allowed us to compare with hers up in Tatlioco. And we found 20 bears that were previously detected in these study areas. Back to 2004, these bears were detected, and we're up at 2015 and on. So 11 of these are females, which is really interesting, and 9 of them are males, and they're moving quite good distances, anywhere from 16 to 67 kilometers, and that's straight line. Of course, bears aren't moving straight line, these Euclidean distances, they're going around stuff, so it's going to be longer than that. We went back to the camera images for these 20 individuals to classify them, and 15 of them we could classify with very good confidence. 7 of these were, again, those large adult males that you see that are coming in, those really, really good shaped males. 3 of them are these large females, so we have some really big females in this area. And 4 of them were these medium-sized females. Medium-sized females are still quite large for coastal grizzlies, by the way, and 1 medium-sized male, so that other male I showed you would have been classified as a medium-sized male, so you can see that they're still quite large as well. So on that population level, or that larger scale, I'm not really seeing the effects. Bears are still being drawn here. There's still an extremely large number of bears coming, and they're coming from extreme distances during the viewing season. So let's take that down to the spatial temporal scale. So within the IR itself, where these 7 cameras are set. And what I found here, so this is plotting, and this is all sites again combined. Okay, and this is just fitting a polynomial, so we're just going to look at the trend of those data. And we see we've got a bimodal circadian rhythm, which is consistent with non-viewed bears. In this case, we see this first little peak coming here in the mid-morning, from 5 in the morning to 9 in the morning. We see this dip, or this lull in activity, happening less in the midday, so from 9 in the morning to about 5 o'clock at night. Then they're active again at night. Actually, they're most active at night. So you'll see at about 5 o'clock, this really picks up and goes till about 10 o'clock at night. Okay, so then I broke that up into behavior. Well, I want to see what's going on here. How does this fit behaviorally with the bear? So I had assigned here rubbing and investigating versus walking by. I plotted those up to see how they fit. And what I found here, so let's just take rubbing and investigating first. When a bear rubs or investigates, which they're doing in these 2 remote camera pictures, they're spending an amount of time at the object. So they're spending some time with the tree, rubbing on it or smelling it up and down. When they walk by, that happens much quicker. So you can see the barbed wire is on this tree here, the camera's here, it's taking a picture. They just walk by. They're not actually stopping and investigating that rub object or spending time there. And that actually shifts over. So they're They stop spending time with objects earlier and start later, and then they move here. They're moving to here. Well, let's look at that when the visitors come. So now we have the visitors here. They're showing up at about 8:30, and they're leaving at about 5:30. Let's take a little bit closer look at that information presented there. So bears appear to be temporally shifting their activity within the viewing area. You see this peak viewing time coming in here, and that is absolutely when it is the lowest active time for the bears, both to rub and to spend time with that object, and that activity is decreasing by about 42%. So we said bears have a bimodal circadian rhythm naturally, so how do we look at whether it's attributed to the visitors being there? Well, let's take a look at other studies in BC that have looked at these activity patterns of bears. We found in northern BC, Hurt et al. Found bears active, this is GPS collar data, from 6 in the morning to 10 in the morning is their active period, and then again at 4 in the afternoon to 10 p.m. at night. In southwest BC, this is McClellan and McClellan, and this is actually much closer to the Orford than the other study. They reported being most active from 7 a.m. in the morning to noon, and then again from 4 in the afternoon till 10 at night, or till 8 at night. So when we look at Orford Bay, we see the bears active at 5 in the morning to 9 in the morning. So it's actually a full hour to 2 earlier than the other studies. And then again at 5 at night to 10 at night. So actually, again, it's an hour later than both of those studies, but it concludes at similar times to central BC, 2 hours later than southwestern BC. So in Sweden, they used data similar to this to look at whether bears were avoiding areas with high road densities, and found that that shift in time was in fact due to high road densities, and that's what we're finding here. That slight shift in time is to be around the visitors when the visitors are there. So in conclusion, the density of bears in this 3.3 kilometer square area suggests that bears are coexisting with the viewing operation. Possibly some adult males may be displaced during the viewing season, but what I'm really interested in is those females, that reproductive engine of the population, and that doesn't appear to be displaced. We are seeing large movements made by both males and females to Orford Bay, to the Orford River and Elgard Rivers. And this suggests that that is extremely important habitat for that, that population of bears. It actually expands 2 of our population units. So on a smaller scale, bears appear to shift their activity temporally to avoid humans. Large adult males were less likely to be active during the viewing hours than family groups. So this is data I was not able to present due to the time restraints here, but as I said, we broke them out into cohorts, and the large adult males, they're much less likely to be seen during the day, but they're there at night. They show up there on the cameras at night. So this shows us that they're still there. Well, what's happening? It suggests that they're seeking spatial refugia during the day, right? So they're going somewhere to refugia areas, and then they're coming back at night and moving around the operation. Bears that seek out these spatial refugia areas, that promotes coexistence. That shows us that these bears have behavioral plasticity. They are able to work around us. They are doing their part to coexist with us. So my hope is that this work can be used elsewhere for conservation monitoring programs, to develop bear viewing guidelines, which are urgently needed in the province of British Columbia, as I see bear viewing exploding on the coast, and regulations, and for facility design. Thank you very much for listening today. This work would not have been possible without a number of individuals, and I would like to thank them all, particularly to the General Manager, Sean O'Connor, who came to me to expand the operation, and instead, after seeing the results and how bears were actually added in refugia areas. And thank you for listening.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in today. My name is Lindsey Mangipane, and I'm a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, working in the polar bear program here in Anchorage, Alaska. And today I'm going to be speaking about a project undertaken by representatives from each of the countries across the Arctic that have polar bears, collectively known as the polar bear range states, to evaluate the effectiveness of bear spray as a deterrent against polar bears. The primary management goal of the range states is to ensure the safe coexistence of polar bears and humans. The range states recognize that human polar bear conflicts will likely increase in the future due to expanding human activities in the Arctic, and a continued increase in the number of polar bears on land due to retreating sea ice. They also recognize the need to develop new tools to minimize potentially dangerous conflicts between humans and bears. Bear managers have long sought to improve non-lethal deterrence tools and techniques. However, there have been few attempts to systematically collect, analyze, and interpret available information on the use of deterrence during human polar bear conflicts. A majority of polar bear deterrence work was conducted in the early 1980s in Churchill, Manitoba. However, there has been little polar bear deterrence research in recent years, despite advances relative to other bear species. Use of bear spray on polar bears is a prime example of this. Although it is widely accepted as an effective deterrence tool for brown and black bears, little research has been done on polar bears specifically. In 2008, Smith et al. Published a paper that showed that bear spray can be effective against both brown, black, as well as polar bears. However, at the time of this analysis, they only had 2 data points for polar bears. This paper had a significant impact on the public's perception of how effective bear spray is as a deterrent. However, skepticism remains surrounding its use on polar bears. Some of the commonly stated objections to reliance on bear spray for use on polar bears include the windy Arctic could render spray useless, and blowback from spray may incapacitate the user. Also, there are concerns that cold temperature in the Arctic could render pressurized cans of spray useless by making it unable to spray. There's also concerns about how close someone has to be to a bear in order to use bear spray, and many don't feel comfortable allowing a bear to get that close. And finally, some just don't think that there are any chemicals that you could put in a can that could be strong enough to deter a polar bear. Due to some combination of these concerns, some polar bear management authorities have banned bear spray from their jurisdictions, including in Norway and Greenland. Therefore, in order to responsibly recommend bear spray as a tool to mitigate human polar bear conflicts, we decided that a database analysis to evaluate the effectiveness under Arctic conditions was needed. To do this, we compiled data of field use on bear spray as a deterrent against wild polar bears from 1986, when bear spray first became commercially available, until present. We found 19 records of bear spray use, including 6 from Russia, 3 from the United States, and 10 from Canada. And as stated previously, we did not have any records of bear spray use from Greenland or Norway due to spray being unavailable in those jurisdictions. Based on the available records, we found that bear spray was successful in 95% of the incidents where it was used on polar bears. We define success as spray having stopped the undesirable behavior of the bear. The only record in our analysis where bear spray use was not successful was a bear that was sprayed at a coastal camp. And the reason that it didn't work was because wind prevented the plume from actually reaching the bear. This is consistent with other bear spray literature, which found that bear spray was affected by wind in roughly 6 to 7% of cases. And one point that I do want to stress is that in all of the 19 incidents that we evaluated, no humans or bears were killed or injured. When details were provided for the incidents we reviewed, bear behavior prior to being sprayed was aggressive in 53% of the cases and curious 47% of the time. The main aggression showed was predatory behavior, which meant that the bear's intent was to eat the person. However, there were also cases where the bear was provoked by a dog or displayed aggressive food condition behavior or was defending cubs. Additionally, we found that attractants were present in 85% of incidents. And this included predatory incidents where the human themselves were the attractant. For the purpose of this analysis, we defined an attempted attack as an incident in which all factors indicated that the bear was intent on attacking the person, but was unsuccessful, usually due to the correct actions by the person or persons involved. Taking a closer look at these records, we found that in 26% of incidents, the bear was actively attempting to attack a person. However, bear spray ended that attempted attack 100% of the time. So this is really important in demonstrating that even a very aggressive bear intent on attacking a person can be deterred by bear spray. We also evaluated the age, sex, and reproductive class and body condition of bears in incidents where bear spray was used successfully, and found that it was effective on all age and sex classes of bears. For all of the bears for which body condition was reported, they were all in either average or below average body condition, and 23% of them were either thin or skinny. This demonstrates that bear spray can be effective even on nutritionally stressed individuals, which are often the most persistent in their advances. However, these results should still be approached with caution because we did have a relatively small sample size. So does bear spray negatively impact the user during an incident? This is a concern that we hear a lot, where individuals are concerned that bear spray could prevent them from further responding to attack due to any effects that the spray would have on them. We did find that bear spray affected the user in 54% of cases. However, the impact was minimal in all instances, with people reporting only minor irritation. Another concern related to bear spray use is that the chemical components aren't strong enough to deter a polar bear. However, we found that in 88% of cases, the bear left the area immediately after being sprayed. And in 3 incidents, the bear was still observed running at over 500 meters away. Additionally, the effects of spray created a negative enough experience that only 12% of bears came back to the scene after being sprayed. In conjunction with our findings presented earlier, demonstrating that successful bear spray use happened 95% of the time, including aggressive bears attempting to attack a human, we conclude that the chemical components in bear spray are indeed strong enough to deter a polar bear. Another commonly voiced concern about bear spray is that the bear needs to be in close range for it to work. As you can see here, the mean distance to the bear when sprayed in incidents we analyzed was 2 meters. Many wonder how you let a polar bear get that close. However, there were a number of surprise encounters included in our analysis where the bear was first seen at less than 1 meter away. So although it is true the bears do have to be relatively close in order for bear spray to be effective, we'd like to note that none of the bears in these incidents we analyzed made contact with a human, despite some being less than 1 meter away at the time they were sprayed. The final concern related to bear spray use on polar bears that I want to cover is related to spray use under Arctic conditions. As you can see here, bear spray was successfully used in all seasons, with a majority occurring in September and October. For most user groups, the probability of having a negative bear encounter is likely greatest in the summer and fall when sea ice is at its lowest and bears have to resort to being on land for long periods of time. Therefore, conditions should be less extreme when there is the highest likelihood of having to use bear spray. Additionally, as you can see here, bear spray was still effective even in winter when conditions are harshest. Our results are corroborated by recent work conducted by Smith et al. In 2020, who tested bear spray under a variety of wind and temperature scenarios and found that even at -23 degrees C, bear spray still had a range of over 4 meters, although the plume was not as well aerosolized. Additionally, they found that even under high winds, headwind scenarios and crosswind scenarios, spray was able to reach targets that were over 2 meters directly in front of the user. They also found that tailwinds actually boosted spray distance beyond calm air scenarios and ended up actually improving the effectiveness of bear spray. As demonstrated above, bear spray provides a user with a very valuable tool for avoiding an attack or de-escalating a bear incident that started out at a relatively low level before escalating into something more serious. Additionally, we found that in 57% of cases, other deterrents were employed without success prior to successfully using bear spray. And in a couple of these incidents, people tried up to 6 or 7 different deterrents without success. And in the end, only bear spray was able to work to deter the bear. In conclusion, our data indicate that bear spray is a very effective polar bear deterrent in a wide variety of situations, even when all else fails. We'd like to thank all of our collaborators for helping to make this analysis possible. And we thank you for tuning in, and we hope that if you have any questions, you'll join us for the moderated session. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Elmeligi, and I'm coming to you today from Canmore, Alberta, Canada, the traditional territories of the Treaty 7 First Nations. I want to start my presentation by acknowledging my gratitude to the many Indigenous nations who have stewarded this land for generations, enabling me to live, work, and play the way that I do. I'll be presenting part of my PhD research, which I completed through Central Queensland University, but I now run my own consulting company based out of Canmore, Alberta. My research focused on the relationship between grizzly bear habitat selection and trail users in Canada's Rocky Mountain National Parks. Our work came from 2 central premises. 1, grizzly bear habitat selection is influenced by human use on a diverse trail network in the national parks, and that human use and therefore trail use in the national park is increasing. We wanted to examine how increasing human use may be impacting grizzly bear habitat selection, and results from this research can be used to inform management planning and tactics to ensure grizzly bears have access to high quality habitat, as well as to identify mechanisms that might reduce potential conflict risk and address coexistence related objectives. We conducted our research in Banff, Kootenay, and Yoho National Parks in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. This contiguous protected area complex covers 9,360 square kilometers of montane, subalpine, and alpine habitat, and is visited by approximately 5.5 million people each year. The data sources we used involve remote cameras, GPS collars, and a previously developed RSF model for Banff National Park. We used a series of remote cameras on randomly selected trail networks within the study area to measure human use intensity and activity type. Cameras were placed on all trails within a trail network, which was defined as the main trail stem and all offshoots and other trails within 500 meters. I had 55 cameras in rotation that were mounted for 21-day sampling sessions at selected sites in the spring, summer, and fall. In all, 426 camera sites were sampled over 8,611 camera trap days from fall 2013 to summer 2015. To examine grizzly bear habitat selection, I used data generated by GPS collars on 25 individual bears. GPS locations were generated every 2 hours. I used a grizzly bear RSF model for West Central Alberta developed by Scott Nielsen in 2005 to represent a proxy for grizzly bear habitat quality. I split the RSF into 3 categories of low, medium, and high quality habitat. With the remote camera data, we developed a human use model that could be used to predict human use levels across the park. To avoid double counting people, we defined human use events as the time when the trail was occupied by people. Human events were defined as a new person entering the camera frame and were separated by at least 6 seconds from the previous event, which was the trigger speed of the camera. We used the total number of human events to classify trails into high, medium, and low use. And we used a backward stepwise regression to define predictors of human use on trails. We found the human use model performed poorly in separating medium and high human use when tested, Therefore, we broke human use into low and high use trails for analysis and for future analyses. To analyze grizzly bear habitat use, we used a step selection function on the 2-hour steps. We used 50 randomly generated steps for each step. And for each step, we estimated habitat quality, straight distance to the nearest road, and straight line distance to the nearest trail. We also identified if that step took place during the day or night, and we ran separate SSFs for day and night. The RSF we were using didn't include Yoho or Kootenay National Parks, so we also ran 2 separate step selection functions, one with habitat quality and one without, so that we could increase our study area and sample size with the second analysis. We used images of grizzly bears from remote cameras to conduct a breakpoint regression analysis to examine if bear trail use was more likely to occur before a certain number of human use events in the day. Breakpoint threshold analyses are used to examine nonlinear relationships represented by a change in slope between the response and explanatory variables of concern. Once we identified potential breakpoint in a plot of the data, we used linear regression lines to determine the best fit for a breakpoint of significance. The bulk of activity captured on cameras were of people who recreated throughout most hours of the day and into the night. The backward stepwise regression showed that most people recreated on shorter, steep slopes that were close to town on sunny weekend days. The next few slides present the results from the step selection functions. For all graphs, blue dots represent significant relationships and orange dots are not significant relationships. Each dot represents the results pertaining to an individual bear. Although some individual variation was apparent, the SSF indicated that most grizzly bears significantly selected steps in higher quality habitats, particularly during the day. This concurs with other research that has found habitat quality is a significant driver of habitat selection. At night, this relationship became less consistent and several bears did not significantly select for higher quality habitat at night. Grizzly bear habitat selection in relation to human use trails displayed a higher extent of individual variation. Low use trails did significantly influence habitat selection, but the nature and intensity of that influence was variable. 12 bears selected steps closer to low use trails during the day and night. 6 bears selected steps farther from low use trails during the day, and 8 bears selected steps farther from low use trails at night. Most subadult bears used habitat nearer to low use trails during the day. More variability was observed with bear step selection in proximity to high use trails, and fewer significant relationships were found. Half of the grizzly bears selected steps closer to high use trails and half farther from high use trails during the day. 2 females with cubs selected habitat close to high use trails, and 2 selected habitat away from high use trails, regardless of the time of day. At night, fewer bears displayed a significant relationship with disturbance or with distance to high use trails, suggesting that some bears were not actively avoiding high use trails at night during the human inactive period. These results partially supported our hypothesis that bear activity would be negatively correlated to human trail use, but with the high levels of individual variation, we could not fully support the hypothesis. While these results do not appear significant at the population level, they do demonstrate the significance in habitat selection at the individual level. The breakpoint analysis examining the number of people since dawn found a break at 8 human events. Thus, most grizzly bear events on camera occurred before 8 people since dawn had used the trail, which suggests that bears are more likely to use trails early in the morning or use low use trails. This analysis shows a correlation, but it does not necessarily represent a cause and effect relationship of human use on grizzly bear trail use. People and bears share trails in Banff, Kootenay, and Yoho National Park, but the details of how that happens vary depending on the individual bear. Habitat quality is the main driver of habitat selection. While all bears in our study used habitat around human use trails, some bears did avoid habitat close to high human use trails. We are unclear if this avoidance is out of a fear of being ridden by macho trail users trying to impress someone, or if a biological mechanism is the underlying cause. In seriousness, bears will still select for high quality habitat, even if human use nearby is moderate, but that can put them at increased risk. Bears display an ability to adapt to human use and still access high quality habitats, as evidenced by the fact that the population is still reproducing and surviving in the busy landscapes associated with Banff, Yoho, and Kootenay National Parks. Our data show that grizzly bears use habitat around human use trails and the trails themselves at varying degrees throughout the year, particularly at dawn, dusk, and on low use trails. For bears that do select habitat close to high human use trails or roads, one of two scenarios can result. Bears can use habitat around people and not be seen, or bears can use habitat around human use areas and encounter people. As encounter probability increases, so may the risk of human-bear conflict. Depending on the type and severity of these encounters, management actions may be taken to remove these conflict bears from human use areas and eventually the population. However, human-caused mortality events in proximity to human use areas is evidence that not all individuals are able to successfully coexist in our study area. While our study didn't measure mortality directly, these two headlines pulled from the local paper this past August demonstrate a real mortality risk. All three of the grizzly bears in the headline were killed in highway vehicle or train collisions. Two were in close proximity to towns and busy human use areas. Our research sheds some light on how bears are using trails around people, which can be an important part of considering management effectiveness at the landscape scale. Community programs that engage residents in coexistence activities to reduce conflict in human use areas are also part of life in the Banff-Bow Valley corridor. But from a parks management perspective, coexistence programs can be expanded to include how and when people recreate. Limiting human access and or enhancing habitat quality away from human use areas should be considered, especially in areas that are near contiguous secure habitat. For example, Parks Canada instituted a nighttime closure from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. of a popular roadway called the Bow Valley Parkway from March 1st to June 25th to increase habitat security for grizzly bears and decrease the likelihood of encountering people. This directly benefited at least 2 females with cubs and 4 subadult bears with home ranges overlapping this area in our study. This management action has proven effective for roads, but it has not yet been applied to trail networks. So overall, we think that coexistence is possible, and we hope that our work can be used to help to prioritize grizzly bear habitat security and to use management programs that promote coexistence, but also find ways to ensure people have adequate access to recreational opportunities without the risk of conflict. I want to thank you very much for all of your time. I want to thank all of my 97 volunteers and the residents of Canmore, my supervisors, and all of my funders for this project. It really was a team effort. I will be part of the live Q&A for human bear interactions and management on September 15th at 9 to 10 a.m. And I look forward to hearing your questions then. Thank you so much. Take care.
Hi, my name is Rachel Urbanek, and I'll be presenting on the survival of American black bears post-rehabilitation on behalf of my co-authors, Mike Gillikin, Colleen Offenbuttle, and Casey Dukes. So there's very little information in the literature regarding the fate of American black bears after they've already been released from a rehabilitation center. Due to their rigors in adjusting to this new environment and landscape that they've been released into, the most precarious time for these rehabilitated bears and the months immediately following their release. The survival of a rehabilitated black bear is thought to be influenced by a number of factors, including hunting pressure and the season of which it was released. And we do know that young and inexperienced bears tend to travel more than adults, and as a result, they tend to be harvested by hunters more than older bears. Post-release movements in general and the bear's behaviors contribute greatly to whether or not an individual rehabilitated black bear is going to survive that first year. In addition, variable habitat quality and the food availability between different release sites can have a big effect on bear movement patterns and, of course, then eventual survival. Things such as road volume and um, the area of release in terms of landscape features can also play a big role in the survival of black bears. So our study was based in North Carolina, and as you can see from this map, the black bear range within the state is predominantly focused in the western mountains or the eastern coastal plain. The mountain bear management unit is comprised mostly of spruce fir forests, hardwood forests, bogs, and floodplain valleys, whereas the eastern coastal plain BMU is dominated mostly by wetlands, longleaf pine forests, and maritime forests. In terms of the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission's Black Bear Rehabilitation Program, they annually capture orphan cubs of the year. And if they're not already weaned or if they're in poor condition, they're placed with 1 or 2 licensed wildlife rehabilitators. After they are weaned and they're healthy, with their stay from the rehabilitator, they typically are moved to a 0.92 hectare enclosure in about the time of September. This is on NCWRC property. It's away from the public, and it's within a hardwood forest. And the goal of the program really is to minimize any habituated behavior that may have been learned prior to or during the time spent with the rehabilitator. So within this enclosure, the bears are fed remotely, and they're held over winter in the enclosure. And they're released between late June through July. So they're about 1.25 to 1.5 years old. And this lines up with natural family separation in North Carolina. This timing also correlates with high natural food availability and then also avoids the very beginning of the regulated bear hunting season, which is in mid-October. Before we release them, each bear is uniquely marked. So we use ear tags, we tattoo the inner side of their lip, and then we also put subcutaneous pit tags in them before we release them. Of the studies in the literature that have looked at survival of rehabilitated black bears, most of these studies really looked at individual variables independently rather than holistically at survival. So what we wanted to do was look at landscape features, biology of the bears, and then also their behavior in a holistic approach to really determine what major factors are affecting rehabilitated bears within the first year after they were released. And our goal basically was to help add to the growing body of literature that is out there on bear rehabilitation research so we can help inform other programs as to what's critical for the species restoration efforts. So our study took place between 2015 and 2018 when we were putting GPS collars with drop-off mechanisms onto the rehabilitated bears before we released them. The bears were released in 6 different locations within the NCWRC designated game lands, and if they were orphaned within the mountains, then we brought them back to the mountains, and the same thing with the coastal plain bears. We gave preference to sites that were designated bear sanctuaries, so there was no hunting, and we tried to find sites also that were more remote so that they weren't really adjacent to any developed areas. During this time, we had 28 bears in total. 19 came from the mountain, where 9 were females and 10 were males, and 9 came from the coastal plain, where we had 4 females and 5 males. The collars themselves took a location every 2 hours, and then the collar was manually removed after 12 months, either from mortality or remotely released or dropped off. Mortality itself was determined at either the harvest date or from the mortality signal from the GPS collar. We calculated both the naive annual survival as well as known fates modeled survival using program R and the package RMark. We used a 30-day period looking at 15 different covariates to estimate survival. 3 of them were behavioral covariates, and these were all established in a concurrent study that my colleague Colleen Offenbottle is presenting on, and it will also have a recorded presentation. But that was daily linear distance, daily Euclidean distance, and then a daily movement ratio, which looked at really the tortuous pattern by calculating linear distance divided by Euclidean distance. In terms of landscape covariates, we included the percent farmland within the home range of the bear, the percent woody cover, percent development, and then we looked at road density in 4 different ways. We looked at total road density, but we also examined the potential effects of just the subcategories that the Department of Transportation offers, such as local roads, collector roads, and arterial roads, because they all have different volumes of cars as well as speeds and multiple lanes. And so potentially those factors may have had an effect on survival. On the biological side for covariates, we included sex and the release weight. And then for the program side, we looked at what year the bear was released, the specific location, as well as whether they were released in the mountains or in the coastal plain. In total, we had 41 models, and we did have a lot of variability within those models. So we actually used up to 3 delta AIC points to look at what was competitive. And we also examined model deviance, the AIC relative importance weights, and the logit parameter estimates when deciding what variables had an effect on survival. Okay, now on to our results. As mentioned, we colored 28 bears, and in general, we had more fixes in active color days for male bears and bears residing in the mountain region. The greatest weight of any of the bears was 81 kilograms for a male bear, and the lowest weight was 39.5 kilograms for a female, and both of those were in the mountain region. When we released these bears, the male bears on average weighed about 37% more than the females, but the weights themselves didn't differ between both regions, the coastal plain and the mountain region. 61% of the 28 rehabilitated bears that we released died within the first year. And of that, most of that was from legal harvest, followed by suspected emaciation, megaesophagus, suspected illegal take, an incident resolution that was actually from a human-bear interaction, and then vehicle collision. We're looking at the regions. There were more bears that died in the mountain region than the coastal plain. And by sex, we had more females die than males. We calculated our naive survival rate. It was 0.21. So for our known fate analysis, we had to exclude 4 bears because of discrepancies within their movement patterns and behaviors. And to break that down, they were 3 from the mountain, 1 from the coastal plain, or on the sex side, it was 1 female and 3 males. Of the 24 bears that we were able to use for our known fates analysis, we had 9 models that were competitive that described 67% of the variability, and our annual survival estimate was 0.63. Road density and the amount of development within the bear's home range were the topmost covariates that affected survival in our study. Basically, the presence of any road within a bear's home range immediately reduced the estimated annual survival to less than 98%, and it was an exponential decrease with any little bit of extra road density in the home range. But surprisingly, looking at development, we found that there was a pretty positive effect when there was 6 to 11% of the home range that included some sort of development, and that corresponded to about a 90 to 100% annual survival estimate. Sex had a moderate influence on survival. In general, male bears were 7 times more likely to survive than the females, and weight also had moderate effects on survival. The bears that we released that were at least 71 kilograms had an estimated annual survival of over 80%. Movement ratio had a slight effect on survival. And again, movement ratio was calculated by looking at the linear distance divided by the Euclidean distance. So on this x-axis, the higher values are essentially the more tortuous movement patterns of a bear, whereas a value closer to 1 would be the bear really moved in straight line distances. And in general, bears exhibiting a more tortuous movement pattern were estimated to survive slightly less than bears displaying a more straight line movement pattern. The percent of a bear's home range that included farmland had a very small but negative effect on survival. In general, bears that had up to 26% of farmland covering their home range had a very, very slightly higher chance of dying than bears that had no farmland in their home range at all. And then in addition to that, we had a very small effect of region of release. In general, mountain bears had a higher survival rate than coastal plain bears. So that sums up the basics of our results, and we'll move on to the discussion. Our model constructed annual survival estimates were within the range of the studies that were reviewed by Beecham et al. In 2015. But our calculated naive annual survival estimate was much lower than the pooled annual survival of those studies also within that review. Our naive survival estimate was more similar to that reported for subadult wild males, not rehabilitated males, in Western North Carolina. Legal harvest was the primary cause of mortality for bears that suffered a mortality during their first year in our study, and that is pretty similar to most other studies. So road density and the percent of developed land within a bear's home range were the most predictive variables of survival in our study. And as I mentioned, the slightest bit of increase of road density in a bear's home range dramatically decreased survival of our bears. Even though there was only one mortality attributed to vehicular incidences, we think that road density is acting more like a proxy to hunting accessibility than really the fact of roads causing the mortalities themselves. As I also mentioned, if a bear had 6 to 11% development within its home range, its annual survival estimates were 80% or higher. And this is likely because urban areas tend to provide a refuge for bears, usually because of hunting ordinances or just lack of available parcels or sizes of parcels to be able to hunt. Surprisingly, farmland cover in the bear's home range really didn't have an effect on survival in our study. There's been other studies that I hypothesize that ag areas can be important food resources for bears, especially as development starts to stress other land covers. And bears have been found that they are actually less stressed while foraging in agricultural fields compared to other land covers. But since we didn't find a relationship between the percent of farmland within a bear's home range and our survival, it may be that that farmland may be appearing advantageous, but it's not actually playing an ultimate role in the annual survival of the bears. In fact, the benefits, at least in North Carolina, of agricultural forage is probably offset by increased hunter access to that farmland. In terms of biological covariates, release weight was positively correlated to survival. Again, bears that were weighing over 71 kilograms at their time of their release had a much higher survival than other bears. Kant in 2003 surveyed 39 different black bear rehabilitation centers and found that only 60% of those centers considered weight a criteria. And of those centers that were surveyed that provided data, this was their average range and their range of bears that they released, which you can see is much lower than what we found would be contributing to a higher survival rate. Contrary to other studies, a disproportionate number of our females died within the first year compared to male bears in our study. 3 of those bears that died that were all females were ones that died of emaciation, and their release weight was 39.5 to 52 kilograms, which you can see falls within the range found by those reported in Kant 2003, but it is much lower than what we found actually helps increase survival. Again, our male bears on average were 37% higher than females at the time of release. And so this is indicating that we probably had some dominant behavioral issues between the males and the females using the remote feeders in the enclosure. Aside from these bears that died of emaciation, legal harvest was the primary cause of mortality for females in our study. And in contrast, when we're looking at in total both wild bears and rehabilitated bears across the state during our study period, male bears actually comprise the majority of the total harvest. And so we thought perhaps that the method of hunting, that is, hunters using hounds versus still or stand hunters, may have contributed to this discrepancy. But when we looked at the numbers, we actually had equal numbers of rehabilitated bears or total bears that were hunted by each harvest method. So although these target preferences appear in North Carolina, it just seems that our results indicate that female rehabilitated bears may be more susceptible to hunting pressure than wild bears. Movement ratio was a very minor covariate that we identified in our models. In general, the more tortuous movement that a bear made, the less chance they had at surviving that first year. There's plenty of studies that have reported that transplanted bears wander at random until they establish a home range. And our bears certainly did that between both regions. And in general, the bears displayed slightly more tortuous movement behavior, maybe just a bit more prone to harvest because they're moving frequently around, but they're typically remaining in the same area. And finally, we did have a regional effect on survival. Bears released in the coastal plain were harvested at a greater rate than those released in the mountain region. And this reflects a typical trend observed in North Carolina for the last several decades. Okay, so summing this all up with management implications, we have two general recommendations to improve survival of rehabilitated bears. The first one is that release locations need to be in areas with limited to no bear hunting. This should be either by intentional means, where it's a bear sanctuary like we used, or potentially by proxy, such as areas with limited roads. The other one that we recommend is pursuing any steps that's going to increase the weight of the 1.25 to 1.5-year-olds, like we released in our study, their weights prior to release, so that they weigh at least 71 kilograms to enhance survivor. Like I said, in our study, male bears were of much greater weight than female bears, and so it's likely that they were dominating access to the supplemental food. So if that is happening in your rehabilitation center, one solution might be just to separate the males and females with an additional enclosure or perhaps a partitioning. But if that can't work through isolation, then another solution could possibly be just placing additional feeding stations in the enclosure to try to provide more equitable access. In fact, this is what the NCWRC did last year, and they were much more successful in increasing the weights of the females in their enclosures. With that, I just want to foremost thank the Pittman-Robertson Fund for funding this research, as well as, of course, the collaboration between UNCW Environmental Sciences and North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission. And my quote-unquote office hours are going to be on September 15th, and I have this in Eastern time because that's where I am. It's at 11 a.m. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that I can then. Thanks.
Recording.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session. I hope everybody enjoyed yesterday's sessions. Some really good talks. I'd like to thank Lori and the rest of the organizing committee for all the hard work they've put in. It's been quite the chore lately. We also want to make sure that we thank Counter Assault, the sponsor of this session, on human bear conflict and management. Okay, I'm going to begin. Before we start taking questions, I hope everyone's had a chance to view all the talks from these ladies. I'm going to read some short bios as a way of introducing everyone, and then we'll move into the question phase. Okay, first, and if I practiced everyone's names, and hopefully I won't mess them up here at the last second. Sarah Elmeligi is her research is focused on the impacts of recreation on grizzly bear behavior and habitat use in Western Canada protected areas. Sarah applies an interdisciplinary approach to her research, integrating human dimensions with grizzly bear ecology to examine coexistence holistically. Both her master's and her PhD research have influenced park management plans and how park visitors are managed to ensure grizzly bears have access to high quality habitat while also providing a highly enjoyable recreational experience. She has worked for environmental nonprofit organizations in academia and in government. She currently owns her own consulting company and is the author of the recently published book, What Bears Teach Us. Rachel Urbanek is an associate professor and assistant chair in the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Rachel and her students research wildlife population dynamics, predator behavior and management around endangered species, and human-wildlife interactions to inform wildlife management by state, federal, and non-governmental agencies throughout North Carolina. As for specific work with bears, Rachel has been collaborating with Colleen Alfenbutel, the North Carolina black bear biologist, since 2018 to assess the success of North Carolina's black bear rehabilitation program and assessing effectiveness of several aged highway crossings and their ability to guide bears safely away from traffic. Lana Ciarniello has worked with black and grizzly bears since 1993, 28 years now. She is co-chair of the IUCN Bear Specialist Group's Human Bear Conflicts Expert Team. Her research interests focus on the interaction of humans and bears, particularly as they relate to the profound impacts on the Anthropocene. In 2015, Lana was asked how best to expand an existing commercial bear viewing operation to accommodate more guests and viewing opportunities. Upon examination, she discussed with the client about exploring population level conservation issues on bears that may result from BC's unregulated commercial bear viewing industry by using science-based, quantitative, and non-invasive methods. And last, Lindsey Mangipane is a polar bear biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Since joining the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2019, Lindsey's work is primarily focused on preventing and mitigating human-bear conflicts. Additionally, Lindsey works as one of the representatives of the United States to the 1973 Agreement on the Conservation of Polar Bears, otherwise known as the Polar Bear Range States. Before joining the service, Lindsey worked with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, where she helped to resolve conflicts between grizzly bears and people. She then attended graduate school at Mississippi State University, where she completed her master's thesis, evaluating the effects of dietary plasticity and landscape heterogeneity on brown bears in Lake Clark National Park and Preserve. Lindsey lives in Anchorage, Alaska, with her husband Buck and their curly-tailed super mutt Stanley. Okay. With that said, I've got a few questions in my back pocket just in case, but let's go ahead and open it up to some questions from the audience. Everyone, you can type your questions into the chat, hover toward the bottom of your screen, click on chat to everyone, or you can raise your hand in the reactions. Again, hover down below, click on reactions and raise your hand. Okay, there's got to be a first. Let's go.
Yeah,
You might just like my classes.
Yeah.
Break the seal.
Okay, well, tell you what.
Yeah.
This is something just for all of the speakers here to think about. The theme of this conference, of course, is conserving bears in a changing world. So toward the end of this thing, kind of think about this throughout the session, but think about your particular research, your study, and try to tie that into the theme of this conference. We'll just discuss it at the end, a brief discussion. Okay, we have a question. Lori, do you want to handle that? No, never mind, I'll do it. Question from well, hold on a second here. From Kay Kimball. Question for anyone, namely Sarah and Lana. In your research, can you speak to the differences in sows with cubs and single male bears? Are females seeking out humans as a protection against predatory males? Either one of you.
Do you want to go first, Lana? Or do you want me to?
Sure, I'll go first. Okay, so yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you for asking that. And that definitely could be one of the possibilities. So we definitely see females and females with cubs in particular during the visitor hours more than we would necessarily at the night times. And that could be viewed as definitely seeking protection from humans. It also could be because adult males are avoiding humans. So they're more active at night. So I think you maybe have those two things acting together. It's not just one, and not just the safety of humans, but it's also that adult males are avoiding the humans being there. So that acting together has definitely seeing more females with cubs during the viewing hours during the daylight. Sarah?
So I mean, I did my master's on the coast, and so I'm familiar with some of the patterns in that regard that are being observed in coastal populations. And so I was particularly interested to see if we could find that in the interior as well, and I couldn't. So in my research, I really found, like, the biggest thing was the individual variation in response to human use among grizzly bears. And so I had 2 females with cubs select habitat close to high human use trails, and 2 females with cubs select habitat away from high human use trails. And so the reasoning for that, like whether that's an avoidance of dominant male bears, I can't really say, because there was also males that selected habitat near people and males who avoided that. So I don't think we see the same clear pattern of females with cubs using habitat around people in the interior as we do on the same way on the coast, at least not in Banff and Yoho and Kootenay National Parks.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question, Katie Martin. She has a question for Rachel. What were some of the home ranges like for the released rehab cubs during their first year as compared to non-rehab bears in those same landscapes? Second part of the question, were any of the rehab bears visited in dens their first winter after release? And if so, what was their body condition compared to the time of release?
So I was reading it along as I was listening. We didn't actually, I wish we could have, but we didn't have any collared bears that were wild that weren't rehabilitated. So we couldn't do a direct comparison of what the home ranges were like from wild bears at the same time as rehabilitated bears. I guess next Wednesday at the same time, Colleen will be presenting kind of our parallel study that talks about the spatial movement patterns and home ranges of our bears. We did see a little bit of differences between the western side and the eastern side in terms of the eastern, and it's just based on the way that the landscape is. And so on the eastern side, they were using more agricultural land, whereas the western side, they had more forested land. So in terms of that, I couldn't answer much else in terms of how it related to the non-rehab bears in the same landscapes. And then Colleen can answer whether or not, because she does all the bear visits for the cubs. I don't know if she actually checked in on any of them that had collars. So if she can chime in.
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm co-author on Rachel's presentation. So first part of the question, we didn't have any non-rehab bears collared that were of same age. Currently, actually, we do have an urban suburban bear study in Western North Carolina, Asheville, to be specific, in which we are starting to put collars on bears of similar age. But again, yeah, we didn't have any non-rehab bears of similar age that we were tracking at the same time. So unfortunately, I can't compare it. Though I suspect, yeah, our rehab bears probably moved around a lot more, but based off of just kind of my 20 years of knowledge of how younger bears move around the landscape once they disperse away from the female, overall, I don't think home range was really any different. They moved around a lot more, but in terms of overall home range, I strongly suspect it did not differ. Secondly, did we visit the bears in their dens? To be honest, for various reasons, we weren't able to. But I will say anecdotally, based off of pictures we got from remote cameras that are on the landscape, mainly from hunters, I dare say that North Carolina probably has at least 500,000, if not more, game cameras on the landscape, just because they're such a popular thing for the public to use nowadays. And we would get videos and photos of our bears, identifiable either by the ear tags and or the GPS collars. And just based off those photos we got, based off the bears that were harvested by hunters that we got our hands on, bear condition was fairly good. Again, upon initial release, there was some weight loss, but then they quickly gained it back. So I would say there's really no difference long-term in the body condition between rehabbed and non-rehab. These bears quickly figured out what they could find to eat and started to bulk up after the initial few weeks of trying to figure out, all right, I'm in a new spot. Where are those food resources? So hopefully I answered the question as best I could.
Okay.
Our home range sizes were equivalent to wild bears in North Carolina when they were establishing, but we had a couple bears that continued to roam that we couldn't get an established home range on. But Colleen's presentation is recorded, and you can learn a little bit more about that.
Okay, next question is from Mihai. He's, and Mihai, I hope I get this correct. Close viewing of bears by tourists has an influence on bear behavior. Is that in terms of increasing tolerance and therefore the potential of increasing or decreasing conflicts? And that's to Lana and Sarah.
Okay, hi Mihai, how you doing? Okay, how do I see these questions?
Click on your chat down
Okay.
below.
So Mihai, close viewing of bears by tourists has an influence on bear behavior. So that's a question mark. Yes, it does have an influence on bear behavior for sure. So it habituates, the bears are habituated. And so that just means that they have that lack of a fleeing response to a neutral stimuli. So the people are not feeding them at all. They're not providing any positive reinforcement from a bear's point of view, but they're also not shooting them with rubber bullets or chasing them with dogs. So there's no negative as well. There's no aversive conditioning. So that neutral stimuli, the human bears just tend to ignore it. They're just there. So that's what happens. And the second part of the question, in terms of increasing tolerance, yeah, absolutely. And potential for conflict. What I don't know, what would have been a super interesting addition to the study, and I didn't have the ability to do, I wasn't allowed to use radio collars. So as I put in the presentation, there could be no marking of the bears at all, because then they weren't viewed as wild bears for tourists, right? But I always wondered where they went to, and I always heard people saying that, well, when they leave that Orford Bay situation where they know those predictable tourists are, then that fear comes back of humans and they act differently. I don't know. I have no idea. And Orford Bay was a 2-hour boat ride in, so it wasn't really close to any communities. So I didn't get to see whether those bears sort of moved out and then caused conflicts in areas because they were so habituated. I do know that in the operation, certainly when I was there was absolutely no food available to those bears at all, no food allowed at towers. So there were no rewards in that situation to give them that. They were truly just habituated. And I didn't hear of any conflicts with these animals, but as I said, they weren't tagged in any way aside from their DNA.
Yeah, I think that is definitely a risk that we have here in the Rocky Mountain National Parks, largely because there is not this big swath of wilderness with low human use outside of the parks and protected areas. So basically, once bears leave Banff National Park or Kootenay or Yoho National Park, they're more likely to enter an area of higher levels of human use. And so if they have grown up in Banff or in the national park system and have become habituated to or tolerant of people, they may display those same behaviors when they leave the protected area. And enter, an adjacent community or agricultural land or motorized recreation areas. And they may engage in those same behaviors, but in that context, it could be a conflict type situation. And we have had incidents of several grizzly bears who do leave the park and who enter into conflict outside of the protected area and end up either being translocated, relocated, or ultimately destroyed. So I think it's a little bit different in the national parks because it's not a bear viewing industry. It is really people engaging in some form of recreation, hiking, mountain biking, picnicking even, and encountering grizzly bears or black bears on the landscape while they're engaging in that behavior. And so a lot of our communication to visitors is to prepare for an encounter, like to have bear spray and have a plan and have an alternate if a bear is in the area, but also how to behave in an encounter to reduce the chance of conflict. So asking people to leave the area if they encounter a bear is kind of the primary preparatory educational message, I guess you could say, for visitors. But I definitely think we have an issue with, we definitely have grizzly bears that are selecting habitat close to high human use trails. And those bears have a higher chance of encountering people. And that also, so that can lead to higher chances of conflict. But to me, that also says that those bears already have a level of comfort, whether they're tolerant of human use or they've become habituated over time to that human use, they are more comfortable being around people. But the question around coexistence in an area like this is really also stems from how comfortable are people being around bears. And that, I think, is where we have the complexity of management, especially when bears leave the protected area, because people think it's okay for bears to be here, but I don't want them over here. And bears don't understand those rules. So I think that that's where we start to see a little bit higher conflict risk.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Lana and Sarah. Lana, this next one's for you. It comes from Frank. You discussed the unregulated aspects of bear viewing on the BC West Coast. In light of your findings, what do you think can be done to improve that situation?
All right. Hi, Frank. Okay, the bear viewing industry really needs to be regulated, and what can be done. And I think I've got a lot of friends in government that also know this and that are in that position to do this, and that also, I know, watch the talk in this work. And I think that we are moving towards regulation in this industry. And that's one of the reasons why I did a push on getting this work out in particular, because I think it can really help with setting bear viewing guidelines. So we are going to move towards that way. How they're enforced is another thing, because there are people here just going up and down this coast, and it's really, you can see it moving bears right off of tidal areas, and there's all sorts of different types of viewing. So what I'm looking at is a commercial viewing operation in which you can come in and put regulations on and enforcement on numbers and times and make it predictable. But how do you control that constant boats going up and down the coast, constantly really getting close to bears, and even some people throwing stuff out to try to keep the bear there, like food out and attractants, right? That's going to be really difficult. And I don't envy our government officials who are going to have to work that one out, but it needs to be worked out, because you can see the effects of it, and you can see that it can be equally, they went on here in BC about ending the hunt. It was a very, very big thing to do. And that this ecotourism is going to replace that in all these economic ways. But the impacts that are happening on these animals are happening here, moving them off prime feeding areas in our coastal populations, and it's being completely ignored. So I don't know, Frank, I leave that to our government officials, and I'll work with them in any way possible. And we've got some really good people in there that are looking at it.
Okay, thanks. Lindsay, you're on the podium. Next two questions for you. This one's from Aaron Edge. What do you see as the next steps for outreach to the public about the use of bear spray with polar bears? It seems that we can have research that says bear spray is effective. The most challenging piece is moving from that information to implementation.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. That's a really good question. It's such a good point because that definitely is the big challenge is how do we convince people now that we have this information? I think it's going to be probably have to be a multi-tiered approach, and it's going to have to be different for different user groups. You know, we are lucky in some ways in that a lot of the work that happens in Alaska on the North Slope does have to be authorized by the Fish and Wildlife Service under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So we do have a line of communication where we can, you know, really push bear spray and, you know, have that information available that they have to acknowledge in some way. But when we start talking about our local communities, it's really different. And I think that that's going to take a lot more targeted one-on-one conversations and really, you know, working at the person-to-person level to try to get that outreach, you know, rather than something more broad. So I think that that's definitely going to have to be something that is more focused. And then thinking, you know, more broadly, globally, you know, there are still places where bear spray isn't even allowed. So we're really hoping that this paper can be the first step in helping governments kind of convince their officials that, you know, this is effective, it is safe, and it's a tool that we can use that can help keep both bears and people safe. So I think there's definitely a lot of work to do, and it's going to be a big job, but we're hoping this can be the first step.
Thank you. Okay, the next one is also to you, Lindsey, from Kim Annis in Montana. Have there been increases in bear spray use by residents in remote villages in Alaska in the years since more data on it has been available? And have the industries that work on the North Slopes of Alaska embraced the use of bear spray in recent years?
That's a good question. Hi, Kim. It's good to hear from you. The short answer is no. There hasn't been an increase in bear spray use. I think that right now for local communities, for the most part, they have the option of harvesting bears for subsistence. So a lot of times that's what they end up doing when there's a conflict. They end up just harvesting the bear and you know, don't go with as many non-lethal options. I think in the future, as we have more bears on land and conflicts continue to increase, you know, I think that there might be a greater desire from local communities to have other tools. So I hope in the future that we can work with people to try to use bear spray and other non-lethal deterrent tools more frequently. And as far as industry on the North Slope, you know, I think that in general, it's becoming more accepted. I don't think that it's still probably the first line of defense, but I would think that in general, like the perspectives have become a little bit more positive towards bear spray.
Okay, thanks for that. Lana, you're up. For high intensity bear viewing areas where members of the public want to flood in at all hours of the day, do you have any data or ideas about platforms and walkways, recommendations for elevations at which those platforms are placed? Is there a group of bear biologists who are working together to develop a set of recommendations for low impact viewing?
Okay, excellent question. So there are, as far as I know, there are not a set of bear biologists working together for viewing, but I know that I'm discussing it with bear biologists here in the government on setting up these operations. And absolutely, there are ways that they can be set up in your platforms, your walkways, everything to reduce the impact on bears. So what we ended up doing in Orford Bay was selecting out what I call refugia areas, basically safe places within the operation that are of equal or higher quality habitat than the viewing areas. So basically that would be where fish are pooling and bears can get them, where there is no viewing allowed, okay? And so when the bears move there, I believe those large adult males were in those refugia areas. I really wish I could put cameras in those refugia areas. When you're talking 100 bears in 7 kilometers squared, it's not safe. Like there were bears everywhere, right? And so to get into those refugia areas, to check cameras, and the thing with them is that we don't want people in there, right? But I believe that those large adult males were going there because I did walk in one day and encounter 2 of them in there. And that was an interesting situation. And then, so I think they're going there and then they're coming out at night and able to use that. So rather that keeps them there spatially. Temporally, it's really important. If you've got an area that you can't control, I think you need to somehow figure out how to control that. Viewing needs to stop at a certain time and give those animals that time without people where they can come in for those ones that are not comfortable, right? So they read some work where they say there's almost two populations of bears, ones that actually completely avoid the humans and only will come in temporally and at night. I wasn't able to get to that level of that, looking at that from you just using non-invasive techniques. But you definitely want facility planning. You want refugia areas. You want platforms that are back away from banks to allow them to move in certain areas. Some people place rocks so bears are guided where they know they can't walk. So there's all sorts of things you can do to make an operation much more bear friendly, allow them to have their space and their time and their place. And I highly recommend, if anybody's thinking of setting up a viewing area, to do that, to have less impacts on the bears, keep them there.
Okay, great.
Lana, can I just ask a question on top of that? When you're working with this kind of stuff, I mean, that was really interesting and it all makes a lot of sense. But I'm thinking about like our North Carolina Zoological Park, it's the largest zoological park, I think, in the nation. You know, that they try for a zoo to make it as large enough habitats as possible with natural settings. And I was wondering if, I mean, I don't know if there's any others around the world. I'm sure there is. It's kind of like that it's the same kind of principle that in zoos, you know, we try to provide refugia, try to have times where people can't be busy with them. So that might be an opportunity to kind of connect with some people in, you know, the zoo world to find out, you know, what are some of the methods, you know, where it's much closer, obviously, viewing and disturbance with humans on a regular basis and a zoo, and it's controlled. But you know, that might be an opportunity to kind of get some other ideas too. So just a thought.
Great.
I have something to contribute to Rachel's idea too, if that's okay. So that was one of the things I was trying to assess also, is like this predictability of human use. And can we achieve this same predictability of human use patterns in a national park where there are no regulations about when people can hike or bike? Like people, my remote camera showed that people are active on trails in Banff National Park as early as 4 a.m. and as late as 12:30 at night, like after midnight. So there's a very small human inactive window for these bears that might want to access habitat completely in the absence of people. And so one of the things that I looked at was asking the people. So what kind of management options are people supportive of? And how do people feel about this idea of maybe regulating temporal human use on trails that go through high quality bear habitat? So how would you feel as a trail user if this trail was only available from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. throughout the summer? And it was interesting how a lot of people felt supportive of the idea, although there was some hesitancy around its effectiveness because it's never been applied in an interior landscape to the same way. And but I think that there's like a willingness on behalf of the park users to try some of these more alternative human use management options to try to create this predictability of human use in a landscape that hasn't been managed in that way before.
Okay, thank you guys. Question for Lana. I don't, and this comes from Joy. I don't recall if you had a control area where you measured daily activity patterns of bears on a pink and chum salmon stream where they were not viewed. Did you happen to have data for a non-viewed area? I wonder how you would answer someone who says that the pattern and timing you observed is just a response to salmon fishing cues rather than people. For example, salmon are more abundant, easier to kill early in the morning.
Yeah, hi Joy. That's an excellent question. And no, I did not have a control area. This work arose out of a client coming to me and wanting to expand their current area, their current operations. So wanting to add more platforms and more things like that. And when I came to view the current operation and see what was going on, I was sort of shocked at the number of guests that were coming in already and swarming the bears. And so tried to set up something for a population level response and didn't have the opportunity to have another area somewhere else where I could be doing this on a non-viewed population. Another thing to remember is that it's this area, particular area, is drawing bears from an extremely large area, as I showed with the DNA and comparing from other studies. So I'm not 100% sure where another area that is as comparable to this one that is non-viewed would be. So there is an operation on the other side of it, but it is also a full viewing operation. So I don't know where this critical habitat would exist to be to set up that design. So therefore, that's why I said I'm relying on other studies that have looked at that bimodal distribution within British Columbia and also close to the study area, like McClellan and McClellan's, where they have this, and then try to look at that shift that way. I think that that's the best that I can do. If anybody has any other, suggestions, please feel free to contact me. But that having a second control area was not possible. And like I said, I'm not even sure where that would exist on the landscape. And I've kind of intensively gone up and down that landscape. So I think that it's worthy to look at that temporal shift regardless, because I know that I can see the effects. Like I can see that negative effect on those animals.
Okay. This comes from Hanif. This is kind of to everyone. Well, let me back up. There's one above here. Lana, in your experience, is the habituation to humans of viewed bears limited to the places and times where and when they are viewed, or is it more general? This is kind of for all four of you.
Okay, I need to look at that question just so I can see it, and I'm not sure where I am. I'm gonna maybe need
It's
to.
at 816. It came from Robin Rigg.
Oh, Robin Rigg. Hi, Robin. Okay, others in your experience. Yeah, so we were discussing this in that question a bit earlier. I have a feeling, and I don't know, like I said, I can't support this. I didn't have radio collars on these animals, that they are much more tolerant in that situation, that they know that what's going on there. A lot of these are multi-generational bears. They were born there. So they're born there, but brought there by their mothers. And so this is sort of like when we go to Orford Bay and we eat, there are all these people that watch us. and that's what happens, because they do really, the natural behaviors that you see are really quite there. They don't seem to have any of this. They seem to completely ignore humans and the presence of humans, and just sort of move around you like you're not even there. Like it's really quite something, and interact with each other. So I have a feeling that it's situational. I'd love to delve more into that question. But I have a feeling that it's situational. The problem with it being, if that is taken out and they do have that behavior of being completely habituated away from it, and there is hunting or those kind of things, then it definitely could make them more susceptible. That's why I think that would be such an interesting question to look into a bit further. Maybe I'll let others answer that.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? If not, we'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, I'm struggling because my instinct was that it's not situational, but now after hearing Lana talk about it, I'm wondering if it might be. Here in the interior, we have bears whose home ranges, some bears have home ranges with a higher trail density and road density than others, just because of where they are. And a lot of those bears are tolerant, not necessarily habituated. So habituated is like a learned behavior. A bear starts not being tolerant and it learns that being around people is okay, and so it's not worth displaying a stress response. But we have quite a few bears who are basically born and raised in areas of high human activity, And because of the learning patterns and habitat use that is passed down maternally, they're tolerant. So they just live near people because they've always lived near people. And so that level of tolerance, I think they're kind of born with it, but even those bears also have areas in their home range that they access, particularly later in the summer and perhaps in the early fall, that are more in the backcountry and away from people. And now I'm wondering if you encountered that same bear in the backcountry in July, if it would have the same kind of lack of reaction as if you encountered it right around the town of Banff in June. Oh yeah, I don't know. Now my brain is like.
That's why, Sarah, I say so I walked my refugia areas one day and I ran into a female who, with her cubs, who's known in the viewing areas, and she was mad as hell. I was in that refugia area and she backed me right out of there with those
Right.
cubs. Whereas in the viewing area, she's fine.
Yeah, so this kind of goes to, I'm not sure if you all watched one of the talks in the Conservation Applied Solutions by this woman, Ali. She's done modeling around memory and learning for bears, and how it's actually a combination of learning and memory that bears use to refine their home ranges as they get older, basically. And so I'm wondering, in the context of encountering people, if a bear is like, okay, in this part of my home range, I have a high likelihood of encountering people. And so I know that before I even enter that area, I know that this is likely to happen because of learning and memory. And so I don't need to have an overt reaction to that because that's expected. Whereas in the refugia parts of their home range, they're like, no, you're not supposed to be here. I've learned and I remember that this is the space where bears are safe without people. And so then they're more likely to have an overt reaction in that area. It'd be so interesting to try to quantify that somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next question from Hanif. It's for Lana. And he wants to know if you're the amount of ecotourism that you are seeing, is that fairly typical of other bear viewing sites? How might it compare with other areas outside of the BC coast?
Yeah, I think that this was a full occupancy viewing operation. I mean, to have almost 4,000 people in 66 viewing days come through, I don't know how you could add on more to that. But they wanted to, right? So, but like I said, this salmon stream comes down one side, another side, which is owned by a different First Nation, is growing. It's growing exponentially. They just bought a lodge. They're bringing people in on that side. So that's the other side of that same system, right? Like I had mentioned. And I see that going on there. How that compares in other non-coastal areas, I'm not the best one to ask about interior viewing. I think Sarah might even know more than that to me, like in Julian's area or in Europe. I know that there was viewing also when we had our talks in Slovenia.
Okay, Lindsay, you indicated attractants were present in 85% of the incidents, but you also said that people could also be considered attractants. What attractants other than people were involved in the incidents that you researched?
Sure. So a lot of the incidents occurred like at field camps. So a lot of it was just unsecured human food was a large proportion of the attractants. One of the instances also happened in Alaska at near one of the whale bone piles that subsistence harvest whales on the North Slope. So it was a Fish and Wildlife Service employee that actually ended up using bear spray on a bear there. So a really huge attractant. So that was the most part, but in most of our cases, the human was the attractant. The bear was acting predatory. So that was a really large proportion of it. And I wanted to backtrack a little bit to the last question. I just got a note from Dick Schuyler who brought up a really good point that I didn't say earlier in regard to bear spray use by industry on the North Slope. He brought up that a lot of the field crews are working via helicopter, and so there is a lot of safety concern with accidental discharge of bear spray in aircraft. So that is one of the factors that may be holding them back from using it, since they are such a safety conscious industry. So yeah, just another important point for potential obstacles for bear spray use in that capacity.
Okay, that was a good question from Dave Telesco. Thanks, Dave. Lindsay, I had a question that I wanted to follow up since you're on the podium.
Yeah.
Were your events, your incidents that you researched, did these all come from newspaper articles, agency reports, interviews, or was it just a combination of all three?
Yeah, it was a combination of all three. They all kind of came from different sources. Jim Wilder, who's the first author on this paper, he spent an amazing amount of time compiling records of human bear interactions. And we actually have a really large database of interaction data that he spent many hours putting together. So yeah, it's kind of a combination of really any source we could get our hands on.
Okay, great, thanks. Back to you, Lana. What would you say if someone says that the area you're talking about is a small part of the river, and if bears don't want to be around people, they can just go slightly upstream where there are fewer people and do their fishing there?
Okay, thanks for the question. I would say that that person doesn't really know the area, because bears aren't the best fishermen or fisher bear people, women, and they need it to be shallow. They need braided channels to really do effective fishing. They need all sorts of these conditions to be met, which is the actual core of that area. When you go upstream in the area, you are going to encounter a blockage, and fish don't even passage up past there. There was discussion even at one point about blowing out that blockage to try to make more salmon spawning area, right? So that doesn't happen. And when you continue up the Orford, it gets much too deep for them to fish. So that is the prime area when you look at the landscape and when you know bears and bear behavior and how bears fish and what conditions, what habitat conditions they need to get the optimum fishing return. So it actually, I did encompass the critical spawning stream, and that's what I'd say.
Okay, great. Excuse me, Rachel. Post-release, are you going to monitor? Did you monitor them with GPS collars, and how did they react to territorial fights with other bears, if there were any?
Okay, can you hear me clearly now? I moved my mic a little bit closer. Is that better? We do have GPS monitors on them. So we're getting a location every 2 hours from these bears. And because they're released at the same time that they would have naturally dispersed from their mothers, they are doing the same thing that a wild bear would be doing at that same time period. They'd be trying to find up their own territory, their own home range. So their reaction to any bears that have already established an area is going to be the same, I would imagine, by anything that would be a wild bear. We did see with movement patterns, we were looking at them and how torturous their movement patterns were in relation to how long does it take them to establish a home range. And as it relates to survival, the more torturous they were, the less survival that they had. It was only by a small amount because they were all pretty torturous though. They were all really roaming around trying to figure out, okay, where's my next best spot? As we mentioned earlier, we unfortunately didn't have a lot of bears collared we didn't have any bears collared on the east side of the state to have any kind of reaction to say, all right, well, what are our rehab bears doing with the wild bears that are collared? And I'm not aware of any situations where our rehab bears got into any kind of, or at least through GPS, that we could see any close encounters with bears that were collared around Asheville. So we can't really answer whether or not they got into a territorial fight. We don't have any mortalities from another bear, so that's part of it. But yeah, it would be probably just similar to a wild bear that okay, the spot's used, I need to go to another spot, moving on to the next one. So
Follow up again, Rachel, in your abstract, you guys mentioned, or you recommend that people release cubs of the year they were captured, if I read that correctly. So under what circumstances would you recommend releasing them as cubs of the year before they're yearlings versus at that 1.5 year mark?
So yeah, so during our study, we were releasing them at that 1.5 year mark. And the Wildlife Resource Commission is now moving towards releasing them that year. So again, in the fall when they're going to be dispersing, it's less time in a rehabilitation center. It's more time in the wild for them to figure out how to be a bear. Even our rehabilitation pens that they have, you know, the minimum amount of human interaction as possible. They're remotely fed, but it's still in a closed area. The other unfortunate part about it, which is not up to us, was that a few years back, a shooting range was built near it. And so we question how much that actually plays a role in habituation with these bears, that they're used to hearing gunfire. And, you know, the grand majority of rehabilitated bears were harvested. And so, you know, I'm kind of interested in whether or not, you know, if there could be a study of how a wild bear reacts to the sound of gunfire versus the sound of a rehabilitated bear that's constantly around it. So trying to minimize as much of that influence as possible is kind of where our recommendation goes. The caveat to that is that they have to be of a good weight. So our weight recommendations were for the weights of the ages that we released the bears, about 1.25 to 1.5 years old. We did have some issues of a couple bears that were emaciated, and you know, so, and weight did play a big role in survival, especially as Colleen was talking about earlier. You know, they obviously drop in their weight a little bit and then move forward. So, and then start learning how to be a bear and eating food and finding something that's not from a feeder. So, you know, I think there's more benefits than negatives of releasing them in that capture year, but you know, it's a lot to weigh, but I think that there's probably more benefits to keep the human interactions at the minimum for them. Of course, if there's a bear that's orphaned and severely stuck in rehabilitation before it can be turned into an enclosure, that's going to delay things, right? Depending on how the bear was orphaned.
Perfect, thanks. This one's from Dave Backrock for you, Lindsay. Do you have any data on the use of handheld marine flares as an alternative to non-lethal deterrents?
That's a good question. In this analysis, I don't think that we had anyone that tried to use flares, but I would have to look in our database and see if we have any records of that. But I do think it's interesting. We had, I think in 57% of instances, people used multiple other non-lethal deterrents and they didn't work before they used bear spray, and it finally ended the interaction. So we had one incident that had, I think, 7 different deterrents used, and none of them worked until they used bear spray. So I think that it's just a really interesting point, seeing just how effective bear spray can be. So, you know, not to say that other deterrents wouldn't work in other situations, but yeah, I think that it's really interesting just to see that bear spray can ultimately be a really successful tool.
This is more of a comment from our president, John Hechtel. Relative to conflicts from bears that are habituated, many habituated adults seem to avoid conflicts better than habituated young after family breakup. He's seen females keep the family while together, out of trouble, out of conflict, even close to human areas, but then all young on their own end up dead after getting into conflicts post-weaning. He says that seems to kind of be the weak link. Does anybody have comments on that? Okay. Thanks, John. Taylor Green for Sarah. Can you distinguish patience, tolerance, and habituation in bears in the context of bears coexisting with people in national parks? And I'm just going to bring it up. We've got about 10 minutes left. Go ahead, Sarah.
So Habituation, like I was saying earlier, is a learned behavior. So that's the same individual that is slowly changing the severity or the intensity of their reaction over time because they don't get a negative stimulus. Tolerance is almost like a state of being, right? It's like part of the bear's personality. Maybe the bear is just more chill and more relaxed. And patience and tolerance closely related. I mostly think about patience in terms of how bears, we have a lot of like these bear jams, like roadside, hundreds of people and a bear in the ditch grazing. And I think that those bears are incredibly patient. They're also displaying tolerance, but they're deciding that eating those dandelions in a ditch is worth the cost of being accosted by 100 people trying to take a selfie. And sometimes I just think I would be a really bad bear because I certainly wouldn't like that many people trying to take a picture of me while I'm eating lunch. But I think that those three concepts are interrelated. And unfortunately, the only way we can measure them scientifically is if we actually measured behavior of an individual bear over time to repeated and consistent stimulus. And that is next to impossible to do in a wild context. I think you need to be working with bears in captivity in order to measure that, but then that is difficult to extrapolate to a wild bear context, I think.
Perfect, thank you. Rachel, you're finding a survival of released bears in the urban areas, their survival was greater. Frank would like to have you expand upon that thought some more.
Yeah, sure. So what we found, I think it was anywhere from 6 to 11% of development in a home range for a bear actually was a positive effect on the bears. And so, you know, it's ironic that we're thinking about all these interactions with humans. And we know that, you know, when we have a bear that gets into a conflict with a human, and it's a repeated offender, you know, it never usually ends up well for the bear. But we actually only had one bear that was a mortality from an incident resolution. The grand majority of our bears were from hunters. And so what we're thinking is that the urban areas are acting actually as a small refugia. So there's usually hunting ordinances in more urban areas. There's larger housing densities. And so if there's more housing densities, there's less opportunities to hunt if hunting is allowed and the ordinances are allowing it. And so clearly a bear coming into a very urban area is a problem, but a bear living within housing areas, and at least if it's a bear that is not making trouble for itself by obviously hitting up trash cans and bird feeders, and it's kind of keeping its distance as any really successful urban animal can do, then we have some success in terms of its survival.
Well, and I've got a question that follows that. We see our urban bears in the Tahoe area that pretty high survival rates because of the plentiful anthropogenic foods that are very reliable. Can you maybe answer that just a little bit?
Yeah, so I mean, that's all going to be based on the people then. So that's true of any urban animal. You know, animals that are succeeding in those urban cities and environments like the Lake Tahoe bears are doing so because there's a lot more food availability, and there's nice, comfortable areas to live. It really comes to the human side then of how tolerant humans are of that. And so if humans are tolerant of having to pick up their trash can or using different types of trash cans, as we know, I'm pretty sure Lake Tahoe has, and I know a lot of places out west do, you know, that can keep the bears out, and you can live with that coexistence of knowing that they're going to get your trash just like a raccoon would or a coyote would if it's open. Then, you know, it's a matter of vehicular incidences, which we didn't actually see a lot of, that is going to affect their survival. So it'd be a matter of how tolerant the humans are of the bears.
Okay. Lindsay, there are bear spray holders that allow you to fly with bear spray in fixed wings. And Joy would think that these would be allowed in helicopters too. So she's asking about the safety issue of flying with bear spray, if that's real. She says, but I think folks not having the appropriate containers and getting them more commonly used is. What do you think about making handgun shaped bear spray so hunters might be more likely to carry it?
That's good.
That's a good point, Joy. Yeah, definitely. There are totally workarounds to flying with bear spray, and Dick might be able to speak to this better than I can. He works a lot more closely with industry. I think that they have kind of their own set of safety rules and regulations that are pretty stringent, and that might be something that we need to try to work with them on more. That's a really interesting point about the gun-shaped bear spray. I think that's a good idea, and yeah, we should talk counter assault.
Yeah, she just got rich.
Yeah.
Okay, John's got another comment here regarding tolerance of bears at streamside viewing areas away from them. I think there are two different scenarios that may look superficially similar. Bears who are at a stream and the strong desire to get fish is greater than wanting to avoid people. Those bears without the strong attraction of food likely avoid people in other circumstances. Other bears seem to be ultra habituated, have no fear of people, and probably react similarly in any encounters, not only at viewing areas, but also away from them. Lana, do you have any comments on that?
I don't think there was a question in there, was there? So
No, just a comment.
No, I think John's right. I mean, he's done lots of this work on bear viewing, so he knows all this, their behaviors as well. Bears are individuals and they have individual behaviors. So sure, you're going to get those groups of bears, ones that are ultra habituated and the ones that are more aggressive. So yeah, good point. Thanks, John.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one from Proctor, and just let everybody know we've got 4 minutes left, but I've been assured that we can go over since we've got a few questions in the queue here. Lana, not being able to capture or radio collar bears, do you have any abilities, permissions, or plans to look at any biological impacts from viewing beyond reduced time on the stream, like the average litter size over time, reduced number of bears, females, or something else?
All right. Hi, Mike. Okay, so yeah, I have, this is what you saw in a presentation is only a very small part of the data analysis that I've done. So it all went through time lapse, and all of us with these remote cameras know that this is just a brutal process. It's easier to work with by far GPS collar data than I feel than camera data. And anyway, I did break this out into cohorts, but the problem is it's extremely difficult when you're dealing with an area where your seeker estimate is 107 bears to tease out individuals. So to assign individuals to that on who's rubbing at what time is next to impossible. So what I did is I've got it by basically just family group, large adult male, adult female. So I'll be able to add that level in. So yes, it will be broken down a lot more, Mike, that I can get to that. And it'll also be, what I didn't do here, what you saw is a combination of all 7 cameras. But as I mentioned in the beginning, I tried to do a paired design, right, with everything but the estuary, because there was only that one estuary. But there's also an effective camera. So you're getting different behaviors at different cameras pairings. So for example, the ones with the roads that are bisected, of course, I'm getting more walk bys, right? But I am getting rubbing. So that'll all be teased out as well. So what this presentation is more of a broad look at the results, because we only had a small time to do this, but it will be broken out as best I can to that. But like I said, it's next to impossible with that many individuals, unless someone has a really distinct marking like Scarface or Mr. Big is, absolutely huge, right? Like you can't miss his ripples of fat. So those kind of things, I can pick those individuals out, but I can't all the time. So I'll break that out as best as I can. And if I could have radio collared, I would have.
Okay, thanks, Lana. The next question from Mike Madel. It says, excellent presentation, everybody. Lindsey, more specifically, in working with local communities and industries, how do you message the issues of using bear spray in windy environments?
Good question. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so that is something that we hear all the time. Use bear spray when it's windy, but there has been recent work. Tom Smith just came out with a paper last year where they tested bear spray under laboratory conditions, and they did find that bear spray would hit a target that was about 2 meters away, even under really high headwind and crosswind scenarios. So I think that's just something that we need to incorporate into our training and our messaging now. You know, we have a data-driven analysis that has shown us these results, and I think that we just need to emphasize that you know, when it's windy, bear spray isn't going to perform the same way it would when it's calm, but that doesn't make it ineffective. It just means that you have to change how you use it, whether it's, you know, deploying it when the bear is closer, or you know, positioning, or just messaging that you know, you need to use it in a little bit different way. And I think that now that we have, you know, some information that we can really use to back those statements up, it'll be really helpful.
Great. Thanks for the question, Mike. Colleen had a comment in response to John's comment, and I'll just go ahead and read it in case everyone doesn't have access to this chat. But she's also observed that in highly developed areas of North Carolina, adult bears tend to cause less actual conflicts than their young. We rarely have adult bears try to enter a house, whereas the past few years, we do experience yearling bears attempt to enter occupied homes. The young seem to be more willing to conduct bold, risky behavior than the adults. Even so, both are exposed to the same level of human interaction, and both are habituated. And I'll add to that, to Colleen's comment, that we tend to see, and we've actually observed it, the female habituated, highly habituated females sending their cubs into homes, into cars, to get food, and they bring it out to them. They won't enter it, but they send the cubs in to do it. So we found that to be pretty interesting. Rachel, next one for you. Do you have data on what weight range would be recommended for a fall cub release as compared to the 1.5-year weight range that you talked about?
Yeah, so that's where my partnership with Colleen is great, because I do the numbers and the statistics, and I can answer things by the data that we have, whereas Colleen has this wealth of knowledge of managing our bears in this state for so long. And so I will turn that to Colleen.
Sounds like you're calling me old. Hey, so one thing, just for anybody interested in cub rehab, I would highly recommend, if you're not aware of it already, the Beecham et al. Paper that was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management in 2015, in which Beecham and his co-authors analyzed hundreds of rehab bear cubs released into the wild, I think from like 3 different continents, a bias towards the North American continent, but this page several times when I've kind of analyzed our rehab bear program, just because they really dove into the influences on survivorship of these rehab bear cubs. And one thing he felt is, same as I think our, it's the same as our findings, same as other findings, is release weight is critical in terms of survivorship post-release, as well as, release weight really does play into whether that bear may become a conflict bear or not. So, but he also recognized that the longer time bears were in captivity, that also influenced whether the bear caused conflicts upon release. So Beecham et al. Basically said, maximize weight at release and try to minimize the period of time in captivity, which is hard to do because the longer they're in captivity, the more you can beef them up. So now that we're examining releasing these bears in the late summer, early fall, we try to do at least a month before our hunting season opens up. Our rule of thumb is try to release bears at double to triple the weight they would be in the wild. One, it just seems like a really easy thing to grasp onto. When we tell our rehabbers, yeah, make sure that cub is at least 50 to 70 pounds. It's something hopefully easily attainable with enough food, enough high fat food. But also I figure if we double or triple those weights upon release, again, that just gives them a lot of fat to rely on until they get, orientated to their new release site and start to learn where all the food resources are. So to answer Katie's question, hey, Katie in Virginia, you on the meeting. I would say that now that we're releasing bears in September, those cubs were born in January, February, maybe early March. Our goal is that they're at minimum 50 pounds, but ideally 70 to 75 pounds, which again is about double, maybe even triple what they would normally be at this time of year.
Okay, thanks, Colleen. Okay, we are down to probably the last question, folks. It's for Lindsey. In your research, how many incidents involved the use of a long stick as a deterrent? And do you have any information on how it was used and any speculation as to why it was not effective in these incidents?
Yeah, I think in this analysis, we just had one where the long stick was used. It's actually a really common method used in Russia. For some reason, that's just a tool that they use quite often over there. And, I'm not entirely sure in this specific incident why it didn't work, but luckily the user did have bear spray, and in the end that ended the interaction. But yeah, it's pretty interesting how common of a tool long sticks are in Russia.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Thank you to the four of you for some really, really good presentations, and hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conference.